Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, Chapter 6, Halacha 1, and joining us today is the Rosh Yeshiva. Anyway, Rabbi Horowitz, we're very happy to have him. We're continuing in part 2 of this year, and we have here where we've been talking about what is the boundary of the land and what is the status of Sheviis and Trumos and Maasros and the other laws of the land when the Ole Mitzrayim enter the land, and then, importantly, when the Ole Bavel come and enter the land, and what is going to be the status of it. Now, the Yerushalmi normally is going to take the position, and there's a lot of sugyos in the Yerushalmi who are going to support this idea that the mitzvot of Truma and Maasros and Sheviis is going to be rabbinic in the time of Ezra and the Ole Bavel and going on. Yesterday we were covering a position where it was Doraita, where it was a Doraita position, but that's not really the position of the Yerushalmi. So, and by the way, the halacha today is that it's rabbinic. So, the Gemara is going to continue the conversation we're talking about, where it's going to challenge this view that in Ezra's time, the obligation of Maasros and Sheviis is going to be on a biblical level, and this now is going to present the rabbinic level. And Rabbi Lazar says they accepted the obligations of Maasros upon themselves voluntarily. And what is the source for this? Where do we see that they accepted mitzvot related to the land voluntarily? And this is going to come up in the passage in Nehemiah 10:1, and it's also going to be in 33, 36, 37, and 38. And it's going to read like this. The Gemara says, this passage in Nehemiah says, "But despite all of this, we are establishing a lasting covenant and inscribing it. And upon the sealed portion are our officers, our Levim, and our Kohanim." And then it continues and it says that we also instituted commandments upon ourselves to give 1/3 of a shekel yearly, and to bring Beurim, and to bring Bahorot of our cattle and our flocks, and that we would bring the first of our dough challah and our maasros of grain, and of the fruit of every year, wine and olive oil. So the idea here is that we can see the people of Ezra are actually accepting these mitzvot upon themselves voluntarily. And so Rabbi Lazar is pointing out that, hey, all you need to do is look at Nehemiah, and you're going to see that in Ezra's time, they're taking something on themselves that's going to be Rabbanan. It's not going to be biblical law at that time. So the Yafei Marah is saying that the earthly court was not sure whether it was wise to enact these obligations, since it was partly because of the sins of Trumos and Maasros that the Jewish people went into exile in the first place. And they therefore spread out the scroll of enactment in the temple and locked it up overnight. And the next morning they found it sealed, and that indicated heavenly approval. Now, the Chazan Ish says about this that, and by the way, it's echoed by the Rambam. The Chazan Ish says that Ezra's sanctification of the land was biblical in one way, in that when at some later date in history, most of the Jewish people would live in Eretz Yisrael, the sanctification would switch from D'Rabbanan and take effect biblically. And that means that Trumos and Maasros and Sheviis is going to become a biblical obligation automatically, and there's not going to be another sanctification that's needed. So about all of this, the obligations of Trumos and Maasros are going to depend upon the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. And in the original sanctification that Yeshua had when they entered the land and they divided it up, and it took effect at the end of the 14 years when they finished dividing the land, the idea that Rabbi Lazar is putting out there, that the initial destruction of the temple, and when they put the Jewish people into the first exile, the sanctification went away. Now, the land always has some sort of sanctity because Avraham Avinu walked around the land and there's the covenant there. But we're talking about this kind of sanctity for the laws of the land. So yes, it has sanctity, but the question is, are you going to be keeping laws like Sheviis? Now, when Ezra comes along again, Rabbi Lazar is basically saying that this sanctification did not take effect on a biblical level, and it was because most of the Jews stayed in Bavel. And the scripture is going to say in Ezra 2:64 that the entire congregation together was 42,360. So it's really a minority of people that actually returned back. And the idea here is that because of the majority of the Jews were still overseas and in diaspora, it doesn't take effect biblically. And so the idea here is that whenever the majority of the people will come into the land, then it's going to trigger and it's going to become biblical again. So when it's saying that the Jewish people voluntarily took this, they're implying that it's d'Rabbanan. Don't forget, Ezra was the Gadol of the generation. He was the top rabbi at the generation, the top halachic authority. And this is what they're writing. It's clear that it's, according to Rabbi Lazar, going to be d'Rabbanan. Now, the Bavli in Ketubot 25a is saying that there's a brisa that teaches that all or most of the Jewish people have to live in the land for the biblical mitzvah of challah to apply. And this comes from a verse in Numbers 15:18 stating that you must separate challah upon your coming into the land. And what this is trying to imply is that the entire Jewish people, when they were coming into the land the first time, after leaving Egypt, it's teaching us only that upon the entry, where it's saying of all of you, that I said you must separate challah, and not upon merely some of you. So, because only some of you are coming in, and the majority is living outside of the land, the law of challah being d'oraita doesn't happen yet. The Rambam, by the way, is going to extend this rule over to Trumos and Maestros, and obviously over to Sheviis as well. So the Gemara is going to probe into Rabbi Lazar's view, and it's going to say, but how does Rabbi Lazar account for the part of the covenant cited above that reads, and to bring the Bahorot, our sons and our animals, as it is written in your Torah, and the Bahorot of your cattle and our flocks. This again, by the way, is in Nehemiah chapter 10. So the law here concerning the Bahor is going to be biblical even outside of the land. And it's saying that all of the items mentioned in the covenant were accepted voluntarily. So how then could this apply for the Bahorot? And the Gemara is going to answer that. And they're going to say that since they accepted items in which they were not obligated, the Holy One considered them to have accepted upon themselves voluntarily even those items in which they were obligated. So this Yerushalmi is going to dispute a view in Bavli Kiddushin 31a that someone who performs a mitzvah without having been commanded to do so is greater than one who performs a mitzvah without having been commanded to do so. So this Yerushalmi is going to follow Rav Yosef's view in the Bavli over there in Kiddushin 31a, that the voluntary one is going to be greater. So what this is trying to express is that it's going to be even greater to perform a good deed out of a willingness, out of a wanting to do it, out of voluntary reasons, because than it is to be forced to do something, than to be obligated to do something. The Gemara now is going to question the other view that they were obligated on the biblical level at all. So the question is, well, what about after they've left in diaspora for Bahorot? Are they still going to be obligated in that on a biblical level? So the Gemara is going to ask about this, and it's going to say, how does Rabbi Yose Barachanina account for this line in the above passage? And it says, but despite all of this, we are establishing a lasting covenant, and this indicates that they took these items voluntarily. That's a question. And it's trying to figure out, was this a lasting part of the covenant that would still apply when the Jews went into exile? For instance, like keeping the laws of Shabbos, or other things like having to marry a Jewish person or having to wear tefillin? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, since they accepted these obligations upon themselves cheerfully, Scripture considers them as if they had accepted upon themselves voluntarily. So the idea here is that the Jews were happy to accept the mitzvot upon themselves as if they never had undergone the horrors of Nebuchadnezzar's rule, and also as if it never happened with the exile and the destruction of the land. And another thing about this has to do where, a lot of the Jews came back sort of in a battered state. A lot of the people did not marry Jewish, and they came back anyway with their non-Jewish wives and non-Jewish children, and Ezra separated them. He sent back the non-Jewish wives and the non-Jewish children. And the state of observance was not, among all the people, not as great as it could be, shall we say. And so all of a sudden, the Jews get this great inspiration, as if it's like they're at Har Sinai all over again. And they get inspired to keep Torah and mitzvot. So even basic things like marrying Jewish, which they weren't all quite doing before, they wanted to come and cheerfully accept the Torah again. And that means all of it. So in looking at the Bahorot, yeah, that might be part of the biblical things, but they weren't doing a lot of these biblical things even in Babel. They were marrying not Jewish. Some of the people that were coming back were mamzerim, blemished lineages. So there's a lot of things they weren't doing right to get mamzerim. And, it's a thing where it's like they're at Har Sinai and they're accepting it with joy and simcha. And so there's something very special about Jews returning back and coming to follow the way of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and doing it with simcha, and doing it with a desire to do it. And it's as if it was voluntary. That's going to be part of the idea. So there basically, says this Gemara in the answer, it says, since they accepted these obligations themselves cheerfully, Scripture considers them as if they had accepted upon themselves voluntarily. So there's really something very magical that happens when you go and you do mitzvot, and you do it with a good positive attitude, and you try to do it with simcha and joy, and you try to look at the beauty of each of the mitzvot that you're doing. That is very powerful. Now the Gemara is going to question Rabbi Lazar's view about whether it's going to be D'Rabbanan or it's going to be D'Oraita. And the Gemara says, how does Rabbi Lazar account for the verse cited by Rabbi Yose Barachanina, that the land of which your forefathers took possession, and you will take possession of it, he will benefit you and make you greater than your forefathers. So over here, says the Vilna Goan, Rabbi Yose Barachanina used this verse to establish a hekesh between the generations of Yeshua and the generation of Ezra. And it's teaching that the obligation of Truma and Maestros are biblical in both generations. And we covered that in the first part of this shiur, chapter 6, Halacha 1, part 1 of this shiur. And Rabbi Lazar, who's challenging this, is holding that Truma and Maestros in Ezra's day is actually just going to be D'Rabbanan. And he's not going to subscribe to this Hekesh. So then how is he going to interpret this? That's really going to be the question. The Gemara answers it. He says he interprets it as referring to the future to come in the Messianic age. And he's saying that for Rabbi Chalbo says in the name of Shimon bar Ba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, our forefathers inherited the land of 7 nations, but you are destined to inherit the land of 10 nations. So it's going to be these 7 and 3 others. And the Gemara is going to interpret Rabbi Chalbo's teaching to elaborate these 3 others, and they are the Kaini, the Kenizi, and the Kadmoni. And it mentioned in God's promise to Avram Avinu in Bereshit 15:19. So there's a lot of agadic things about the Kaini, by the way. So anyway, the idea here, says the Rosh Cirilio, is that when the Jewish people are going to come to dwell in the land in Eretz Yisrael, and certainly it's going to be much more than the majority, it's all the Jews are going to be taken by the hand of Hashem, so to speak, and brought back into the land. And that's going to be the time, as elucidated and explained by the Rosh Cirilio, that the mitzvot that are dependent upon the land are going to become biblical, and just like they were in Yeshua's time. So really, Rabbi Lazar does subscribe to this Hekesh, but he's really assuming the 2 generations of exile. It's not this exile when they're coming back from Ezra's time. It's the next exile. It's the exile of when they're coming back from the Roman exile. That's when the exile is referring to, says Rabbi Lazar. And this is going to answer this Gemara's question. So basically, he is creating a Hekesh between this and that. Now I want to go back and I want to point out what is going to be the source of this again. And it says that so it says, one second, let's find this. Okay, on the biblical level, it says, and Hashem, your God, will bring you to the land of which your forefathers took possession of it, and you will take possession of it. And this is in Devarim 35, and this is really talking about that the people are going to be returning from Babylonian exile. This is what Rabbi Yose Barachanina is talking about. You can find that in the first part of this shiur. And it says, then after this verse, it says, then Hashem your God will bring back your captivity and have mercy upon you. So this is basically saying that, yes, it is talking about returning back from a future exile, but it's going to be the future exile of the Jews returning from the Roman exile. And that's what it's going to say. It's going to be talking about the Messianic age. Now, it says that your forefathers inherited the land of 7 nations, but you are destined to inherit the land of 10 nations. And this, by the way, is going to be the Hittites, the Gershahites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, and the Hivites. And also some say the Rephaim from Bereshit Rabbah 44:23. And some say the Jebusites from Devarim 7:1. But there's going to be 10 nations there that it's going to be. Now, we're going to try to get into this identity of who are these people and who are these 3 remaining nations, the Kaini, the Kenzini, and the Kadmoni. Kadmoni, yes. Rabbi Yudah says the 3 nations are Arabia, Shalmaya, and Nabatea. Nabatea, by the way, is in modern Jordan. I've actually been there, where the Nabateans had their capital in Petra, and you can see in this reddish rock, you can see idols to snake gods and idols to all sorts of animal gods like snakes. That's what they worshipped out there. And all through the Jordan landscape in this area of the desert in Petra, even not where that famous building is, but all around the mountains there, you can see these snake carvings, which are very, very prominent all throughout there. They built temples there. And so that's going to be Nabatea, Arabia. That's going to be something that's interesting because, you have this this inherent conflict between the two sons of Avram Avinu, and you have one who had a proper brit milah, and you have one who doesn't quite have a proper brit milah, but nonetheless he has a brit milah. And in fact, both of the peoples who are from Yishmael and from Yitzhak do believe in one God, but the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim that the understanding of the Jewish people in terms of understanding monotheism is at a higher level. And you can find that in the end of his second book in Moreh Nevuchim, where he explains about the differences between Islam and Judaism in understanding true monotheism. And Shalmira is talking about in the Targum, and it's saying that it's going to represent Kedar, who is the son of Yishmael, and so it's really kind of talking about this sort of area in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The question is, is Arabia referring to the entire Arabian Peninsula or just part of the Arabian desert? But nonetheless, Shalmaya and also Arabia and Nabatea, they're all sort of referring to modern day Arabs or where these areas would be. And in fact, again, Shalmaya in the Targum of Cain is represented by the Cani there, and that's actually saying, Navat, which is the Targum of Kedar, which is the son of Yishmael. So, according to this view, it's basically that the Jews are going to be expanding out to the east in the future day. Now, why is that important, right? Well, you're going to have these cities of refuge where if somebody does an accidental murder, it's modern day called manslaughter, that there's going to be these three extra cities that are added to the list that Moshe Rabbeinu put in there. There's supposed to be 3 in the land and 3 just on the other side of the Jordan River. And so we know that in the future day that the land of Israel will expand like the deer's skin, and this could be referring to, the size of Am Yisrael expanding out to those areas. Now, Rabbi Shimon says they are Asia, Aspamia, and Damascus. Now, this is a slightly different view, and according to this view, this is going to be in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael. Now, Damascus is going to be the capital of Syria, and Asia might talk about parts of Asia Minor, which is going to be Turkey, and Aspamia is going to be Apamea, and in that area, the Mishnah calls Apamea, calls it Syria, which is also going to be part of modern day Syria. So this would suggest that there's going to be an expansion in the north, and another targum of this that says Apamayas is the Banyas, which is going to be the source of the Jordan River, and that, by the way, you can go visit in Israel today. But that's just one opinion. Now, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says Asia, Cartigny, and Thrace. So this is going to be a little bit harder to understand. Thrace is going to be an area that's just north of it's going to be just north of Macedon in Greece. There was an area, it's in modern day Bulgaria, and that's where the Thracians lived. They were very fierce tribal fighters, and in fact, the armies of Alexander the Great used to recruit them. They had very famous, very heavy javelin throwers. They would wear heavy armor and run up and throw javelins at the enemy. And Alexander the Great used to use them in the armies. And actually, for a couple of hundred years after, they were used as mercenaries in the armies of Macedon until they lost to the Romans. So Asia can also still refer to this area in Turkey. And then the other question is going to be Cartigny. Now, that's going to be interesting. Now, you could think of this as Carthage. And where was Carthage? Carthage was modern-day Tunisia. And it got destroyed in the Punic Wars by the Roman Empire. And you also have Cartagena, which is going to be part of Spain. But don't forget that who settled and created the Carthaginian Empire? It was people from Lebanon, and it was these Lebanon people that were actually Baal worshippers that came over to Carthage, came over to Tunisia and created this Carthaginian Empire. And basically, they were still worshippers of Baal at the time, but it was seeded by Phoenician people. And so this could be referring to Cartagini, basically saying that it's talking about all of the area of the Lebanon because, and why would that be? Because a lot of times the Torah will refer to the source of where somebody is from. So for instance, it'll talk about Japheth. Japheth is going to be modern day Greece, right? And it's going to be ancient Greece. But it doesn't say Greece throughout the Tanakh. It'll just refer to it as Japheth. So it'll talk about the root, and you can get into Kabbalah on it, and it'll be talking about the root soul of the 70 nations and things like that. So it could be talking about Cartigny as being the Lebanon rather than talking about the south of Spain or talking about a part in Tunisia. And that's probably more likely than saying that we're just going to get some piece of land out in Tunisia somewhere. Rabbi says that it is Edom, Moab, and the first part of Ammon. So that is going to be another opinion, and this is going to be saying from Daniel 11:41 that the Jewish people will come into possession of the lands that were occupied by these nations in the era of Moses, and these lands had not yet come into existence when Avram Avinu was promised these lands. And Edom, Moab, and Ammon are going to run along this southeastern area of Eretz Yisrael. Edom in the south is going down to Elat, and Moab and Ammon are on the east, and parts of those are going to be in modern-day Jordan. And by the way, when you look at where the three cities of the refuge are supposed to be added on the other side of the Jordan River, it could also be referring to lands that are going to be in Moab and Ammon. So that's the opinion of Rabbi. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about Rabbi Chelbo's teaching about these three extra groups that are going to be added, and they're going to be mentioned in the promise to Avram Avinu. And it says that he will benefit you and make you greater than your forefathers. And your forefathers, even though they were redeemed from Egypt, they were once again subjugated. However, you will be different. And it says, from the time you are redeemed, you will not be subjugated again. So the Mara Fulda is citing a Midrash Rabbah. It's going to be Bereshit Rabbah 2:5, where it says over there that Rabbi Chia the Great says, from the very beginning of the world's creation, the Holy One, blessed is He, revealed that the temple would be built and then destroyed and then built again. And you can see that where it says, in the beginning God created, and this is going to be that the temple was built. And then it's going to say that the earth was astonishingly empty. That's going to be the temple being destroyed. And then it's going to say, and God said, let there be light. And this is going to be the temple. That's going to be the one that Ezekiel talked about. That's the third temple. And that is going to be perfected in the future of the time to come. And we have a theme that runs through Sheviis that's going to be talking about when will fruit trees be ready? When will these fruit trees bear fruit that are kosher? When, like in Orla, you can't use the fruit, or maybe it's not producing fruit, and then all of a sudden the fruit is ready. And we have this in chapter 5, this hint about when is the fruit going to be ready, being alluding to the Jewish people. When are the Jewish people going to keep Torah and mitzvot? And what this is saying is that at the time of the Messiah coming, the Jewish people are going to be like these fruit trees that are be giving fruit, and the fruit are going to be Torah and mitzvot. And so the idea over here is going to be, from the time you were redeemed, you will not be subjugated again. And it's basically hinting, like this theme that's coming throughout Sheviis, that as you can see, even in the very beginning of, as Bereshit Rabbah 2:5 is pointing out, that there's 3 temples, there's 2 destructions, but 3 creations, and it's going to be this perfected world in the world to come when the Jewish people are doing the tikkun, and the Jewish people are observing Torah and mitzvot. And I really have a lot of thanks in my heart to Rabbi Horowitz, who has taught me so well and has taught me so much Torah, and has a video channel on YouTube that you can see under the name Baruch Horowitz, and you can also learn from him as well. And what's beautiful about the YouTube is that even many years later, you can still be studying with Rabbi Horowitz, even though Rabbi Horowitz gave the shiur 3 years ago. I can still listen to this shiur. So the idea here is, when are the Jewish people going to be perfected in the future world to come? When is this fruit going to be ripe? When is it going to be ready? And so the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, ask now and see whether a man gives birth. And just as a man cannot give birth, so too, from the time you are redeemed, you will not again be subjugated. So this is also talking about a verse from Yerushalmi 36. And the idea here, says the Mara Fulda, about all of this is that in Jewish history, it's going to be like somebody giving birth. And in exile, it's painful and there's pangs, but going through this process, you end up with something really, really good. You end up with a child who you can raise and love, and who's going to love you and love going in the way of Torah and mitzvot. And it's like the same thing. This is when Hashem is giving success and prosperity to the Jewish nation. And then, unfortunately, many people, they become arrogant and they forget Hashem and they forget the blessings. And then this is going to lead into exile and punishment. But in the final redemption, like when the fruit of the tree is ready and it's past the stage of Orlah and it's in the 4th year, it has to be sanctified. This is like what the Jewish people are like in the time of just when the Mashiach comes. It's like when you have the fourth year fruit that you come to bring to be sanctified and eat in Jerusalem. And this is very much an allusion for the readiness of the Jewish people. And, in this final redemption, it's not going to be marked by people being passive about Torah and mitzvot, but rather they're going to be very active about learning Torah and mitzvot. And that's why it's going to be like fruit. And this abundance of Torah is going to be the greatest kind of redemption and the greatest kind of Jewish people possible. And that's what's going to fix the tikkun back from Adam and Chava in correcting the world and correcting the creation. And only Judaism can do that. Only Judaism can fix the story of humanity back from the original creation and set it right. And the way we do that is by connecting to Torah learning and the light of the Torah, and connecting to our great rabbis and great teachers like Rabbi Horowitz, the Rosh Yeshiva. And we have to look at this pattern of Jewish history of exile as being a state of being degraded because we were not following Torah and mitzvot, and looking at the arc of history, like when we have this final redemption, it will be an active pursuit of Torah and an active pursuit of learning. And that's going to be the idea. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a brisa that talks about the borders that are mentioned in this Mishnah specifically. And there's going to be some slight versions that are a little bit different in some of the different Mishnayot, like in Bavli Gittin. It's going to be a little bit different. And in the Tosefta Ocholos 1814, it's going to be a little bit different. But we're using the Yerushalmi version because we're learning the Yerushalmi right now. And anyway, we're gonna talk about it. So the Mishnah says, if one was going north from the road from Akko to Ketziv, this is the Gemara referring to Akko and Ketziv in the Mishnah, and he may assume that the land on his right, that which is to the east of the road, is Tahor, with regard to rabbinic law, that the land of the nations is Tameh, and subject to the laws of Meiser and the sabbatical year, unless you are informed that it is not subject to these laws. So let's explain this. So in the old days, the idol worshippers of the ancient world did not mark the graves. They just dumped bodies all over the place. And the rabbis were worried that if you walked anywhere in these lands, you could become temeh. And you might touch a small bone, or you might walk over a corpse, and the person will become temeh. And they were saying that whoever walks in these idol-worshipping lands has to assume that he became temeh from the parts of a dead body. Now, I will tell you something. There were terrible, terrible wars in World War II in the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. And there is a place near Kursk. Kursk was a place of a very bloody tank and infantry battle. And I've seen photos of it, but they have a boneyard there. And it is, as far as the eye can see, skeletons and bones littered across the ground as far as the eyes can see. And this is what was happening in the ancient world as well. You would have battles. They would take huge numbers of people into these battles. They were very bloody with very high numbers of casualties. And you would have bodies all over the place. And then that's on top of the local traditions about these idol worshippers not having respect for the dead and just dumping a body anywhere. And that's something that the non-Jews have learned from the Jews, to mark graves and to set up graveyards and to organize, these sorts of things. So the rabbis did not want to worry about, these clods of earth and things that would make people tameh. And then you have to go through this week-long purification process, and you have to get sprinkled by the para aduma water on the third and seventh day. You have to go to a mikvah, and so they were worried about it. And the idea is that since the land along this road from Akko to Ketziv on the right is going to be definite Eretz Yisrael, if you're walking on sort of the right side of the strip of road, you can be assured that you're okay. Now, this road going between Akko and Ketziv is not a straight one, and you can assume because, by the way, around the parts of Akko there's swamp, so I think it's assuming that it's not exactly a straight road because you have this like marshy, swampy land right along the coastline. Before you get to Akko, if you go on the train, you can still see swampy, marshy land right before you enter those areas in the north. And presumably this swampy, marshy land was continuing from Akko to Ketziv. So the idea is that if you're going on this road that's going to veer around this marshy land, that the road on the right side is going to be definite Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that unless you are informed that it's not subject to these laws, and he may assume that the land on his left, which is to the rest of the road, is Temeh with regard to rabbinic law, and is the land of the nations, and that's Temeh, and is not subject to the laws of Maasros and the sabbatical year, unless you are informed that it is subject to these laws. So if there's an expert that's with you who can say, that, the road just turned over here and this part was conquered, but that part is not, then you can understand it. But again, this is not a straight road, and it's as if you're walking around this not really such hospitable land. And the land that's going to be to your right, if you're walking north to Ketziv, is going to be definite Eretz Yisrael, and the land on your left is not going to be. And the idea is, how far is this journey going to be like this? And it's going to say it applies until he reaches Ketziv. In other words, it's this full journey from Akko to Ketziv. And basically what this is saying is that if you're walking in this very roundabout road from Akko to Ketziv, which is going to be an area in the north, that could be somewhere around this mountain that is just north of modern-day Nahariya. That's right where this big mountain is that separates the Lebanon border in the modern day. So this is talking about the northernmost part of the Ole Bavel. Okay, so the idea is that the area that's going to be not hospitable, that's going to run along the shoreline from Akko to Ketziv, was not conquered by the Ole Bavel, and might have been just left alone because again, it's kind of swampy, and you have malaria, and you have all sorts of it's not really good land anyway, and in that time you couldn't really do anything with it. So this is talking about what's going to be in the land and what's out. And the Gemara says Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yose, says in the name of his father, until Lavo. So this is going to be a place that's between Akko and Ketziv, according to Rabbi Kanievsky. And the Gemara says that this Lavo, and this is going to be, as we've been explaining, that the right side of this road is Eretz Yisrael, and this was taken by possession of Ole Bavel, but the left side was conquered by the Ole Mitzrayim, and not the Ole Bavel. And so it's going to be clear why the Ole Bavel area, which is going to be definite Eretz Yisrael, is going to be considered tahor and obligated in maestros and Sheviis. And it's also going to be understandable why the sages extended the decree of Tuma to this Ole Mitzrayim area, since it was not under the control of the Jews, but idol worshippers who would bury their dead there whenever they wanted. So that's a deep idea. So why does the Baraisa not just say that the area is exempt from Sheviis? And this mission is trying to teach that somebody cannot perform work forbidden on Sheviis in an area that's conquered by the Ole Mitzrayim. So the answer is that these areas share a status of certain cities, like, by the way, Bet Shean does. And it's going to be surrounded by Ole Bavel, land on all sides, but they're not actually sanctified by the Ole Bavel, like Bet Shean is not actually halachically Ole Bavel land. So initially the Ole Bavel wanted to not sanctify certain areas like Bet Shean so that poor people would have areas that they could go to get food during Sheviis. And so agricultural activity would go on in those areas as it did every year. So maybe the coastal areas were also exempted. That's, by the way, the note by the Chazan Ish in 324. But again, the key idea here is the Mishnah is talking about this area from Akko to Ketziv, and is talking about along this road that on the right side of the road is definitely going to be the land from Ole Bavel, and on the left side of the land is going to be the land from Ole Mitzrayim. But it's basically saying that it's going to be Temeh because the dead people, the pagans that lived there at that time, in the time of the Ole Mitzrayim, used to bury the dead there, and it was the idea is that the Ole Mitzrayim area was not under control of the Jews in that specific time. And so because the idol worshippers would bury the people there, the rabbis had the same worry like with other places outside of the land, because outside of the land you'd have these boneyards all over the place. And so what this is the deep idea that it's trying to show is that it's an area for Ole Mitzrayim, but the idol worshippers that were living there would bury the dead. And so, basically it's saying, it's not, why is this Baraisa saying that the area is going to be exempt from Sheviis? And really what this is going to be trying to get, the idea is really trying to get is that you're not allowed to do forbidden labor for Sheviis in an area that's conquered by the Ole Mitzrayim. So if you were over there on the left side of this road in an area that has the sanctity of Ole Mitzrayim, you can't do this Sheviis work. So even though it's not the Ole Bavel area, you still can't do it. That's what this Gemara is trying to get at. And what's interesting about it is that you would say that, it's tahor, or it's temeh. This land is temeh. And you would think to yourself, well, why is it temeh? Is it because it's outside of Eretz Yisrael and it's going to have the status like, Chicago, or the status like New York or Los Angeles? No, it's going to have the status of this was an area that idol worshippers used to live in the land, and they used to bury the dead there. And that's the problem. It's not that it's outside of the land. It's outside of the land that the Ole Bavel conquered. That's true. But even in land that was not reconquered by the Ole Bavel, what this is trying to get at is you're not necessarily supposed to be doing work in the Ole Mitzrayim area with regards to Sheviis. Now the question is going to be, well, what about Bet Shean, and what about that? Because this mission is trying to teach that you're not supposed to do forbidden labor on Sheviis in an area that's conquered by the conquering armies under Joshua. So, the question is, well, they know that, people would do agricultural work in Bet Shean, and in fact, the Ole Bavel did that. So the Mishnah is bringing up a point that you're not allowed to do forbidden labor or Sheviis in an area that's conquered by Ole Mitzrayim, and perhaps this Mishnah is talking about in an area where it's going to be Doraita, and perhaps what we're talking about in Bet Shean, and now is we're actually talking about that this obligation of Sheviis is actually going to be D'Rabbanan at this point. So because the Ole Bavel did not take it back, then it's outside of it, and it doesn't have that D'Rabbanan status. So if you were in an area that was like in modern day Jerusalem, which was conquered by the Ole Bavel and Ezra and the people who were returning, then basically that would have sanctity, but that sanctity is going to be rabbinic. That's what this is trying to point out. And we were talking about Akko, and the Gemara is going to ask the status. What is the status of Akko itself? And it's going to ask, is it entirely Eretz Yisrael or not? And the Gemara is going to answer, and Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov says in the name of Rabbi Ami, from the following two incidences involving Rabbi, that we learn that Akko was within part of it's Eretz Yisrael, and it has within it part that's outside of Eretz Yisrael. By the way, you can see this in the Bavli in Gittin. This comes up in the beginning of Gittin about the status of Akko. And the Gemara is going to talk about this first incident about Rebbe and trying to talk about Akko being in Eretz Yisrael, and we're going to cover that shiur tomorrow about Akko and the status of Akko. But right now, we're really getting into the differences between what is Ole Bavel land and what is Ole Mitzrayim, and really what it's clear that Ole Bavel area is going to be fully Eretz Yisrael, and it's going to be considered tahor, and you're going to be obligated in maestros and Sheviis. And this idea is that in parts of the area of Ole Mitzrayim, there's going to be a decree of Tuma because the Jews weren't in full control of the land for part of the time, and idol worshippers used to bury the dead wherever they wanted. And the idea is that according to the Mishnah, you're not supposed to perform labors on Sheviis in an area that's conquered by the Ole Mitzrayim. So that's some of the difference between Ole Mitzrayim and Ole Bavel. And again, definitely the Ole Bavel, that's going to be considered tahor, and that's going to be considered fully Eretz Yisrael, and it's going to be obligated in maestros and Sheviis. Have a great day.